Just when people thought that chapter of the story had faded into history, Chelsy Davy quietly posted photos of her newborn son, Finn, and suddenly an old conversation came roaring back into focus. She is 40 years old. She looks radiant, relaxed, and genuinely content. The kind of happiness that does not need professional lighting, carefully staged optics, or a PR team deciding the perfect moment for an announcement. Just life unfolding naturally and peacefully. 3 children, a thriving jewelry business built entirely on her own terms, and a life that appears, from every visible indicator, to be exactly what she always wanted. And somewhere across an ocean in a Montecito mansion, a man who once sat beside her talking about raising a large family beneath an African sky is now watching those photos circulate around the world. According to people familiar with him, news of Chelsy's third child reportedly affected Harry more deeply than almost anything that has happened during the past 12 months. Not because it is specifically about her, or because there is anything other than goodwill toward her happiness, but because of what those photographs symbolize. They represent a very particular life she is living and a very particular life he is not. Tonight we are diving into why this child announcement has reignited attention around what now looks like one of the most unusual public commitments Harry ever made. The One Young World speech in Manchester that several royal observers describe as a major turning point in how informed audiences view the Sussex operation, the Jordan trip footage that body language analysts continue examining, the Vanity Fair report regarding a post-divorce manuscript, and what all of it means for a man watching the life he once described wanting being lived by someone else while his own circumstances become increasingly difficult to manage. There is a lot to unpack here, and every piece matters. So let's begin with Chelsy and why these photos matter far beyond the obvious. Chelsy Davy and Harry were together on and off for most of a decade, roughly from 2004 to 2011, with the kind of breakups and reunions that often define relationships where the feelings are real but the circumstances are complicated. By nearly every account from people who knew them during those years, people who knew them as individuals rather than public figures, their connection was authentic, specific, and rooted in shared experiences that went far beyond celebrity status or public visibility. They genuinely knew each other. They had real conversations about what they wanted. They discussed the future in concrete terms. A large family, more space, more privacy, and a life beyond the limitations of the royal machine. Something that felt truly theirs instead of institutionally managed. Eventually she walked away, and the reasons appear far more complicated than the standard narrative suggests. The familiar version claims that Chelsy could not handle the royal spotlight, that relentless media pressure became unbearable, and that she ultimately concluded a relationship with Harry was incompatible with the life she wanted. There is certainly some truth in that account. But Angela Levin, who has spent more time observing Harry than perhaps any living biographer and whose years of access give her observations considerable weight, has described a version of that relationship that is significantly less flattering to Harry than the conventional story. Levin's account includes claims that Harry often failed to show up in the ways relationships require, expected loyalty without consistently offering it in return, treated Chelsy's academic ambitions and desire for independence as secondary to his own needs and schedule, and reacted to her time away at university with frustration rather than support. One particularly striking detail Levin has reported is the claim that Harry allegedly began seeing other women while Chelsy was at university instead of making the effort to sustain the relationship across the distance. If accurate, that detail alone explains much of the eventual outcome without making royal pressure the primary cause. Chelsy Davy had too much self-respect to continue accepting an arrangement that required her availability on his terms without equal commitment in return. She built her own life in the most straightforward sense imaginable. She studied. She worked. She transformed jewels into a genuinely successful jewelry business without relying on her former royal connection as its commercial foundation, without publishing a tell-all account of the relationship, and without building a brand around proximity to a world she had already chosen to leave behind. She married someone who appears present, supportive, and uninterested in turning the relationship into a carefully managed public product. She has 3 children. She lives in a country she loves and enjoys a life that, from every visible indicator, reflects exactly what she wanted. That is the contrast baby Finn's photos delivered. Not merely a former girlfriend welcoming another child, but the specific life itself. The 3 children, the independent success, the privacy, and the genuine happiness that does not require constant curation. The very future Harry once described wanting, and the future that Chelsy Davy now appears to be living. Now let me be clear about where the facts end and where the speculation begins, because that distinction actually matters. The facts are straightforward. The photos exist. Chelsy Davy's life is publicly visible, and that life reflects, with remarkable specificity, the exact kind of family future Harry reportedly described wanting during their years together. The speculation is everything about Harry's private emotional response. Nobody outside his immediate circle knows exactly how he reacted, and I am certainly not claiming insider access. What can be observed, however, is the extraordinary irony of the situation. A man who once talked openly about wanting that particular life is now watching someone else live it. Whether Harry feels regret, indifference, or something in between is impossible to know. What is visible is the contrast itself, and that contrast does not require any special emotional sensitivity to recognize as significant. If the Palace Debrief is giving you the complete picture on this story, the Chelsy Davy context, the two-child limit viewed through a very different lens, the Manchester speech transcript, the Vanity Fair report, and the Jordan footage, make sure you hit the like button. It costs nothing, supports the channel, and helps this analysis reach people who enjoy diving into stories like this. Now let's talk about the two-child limit, because this remains one of the strangest chapters in the Sussex public relations record, and it looks considerably more unusual in 2026 following Chelsy Davy's third child than it did when it first appeared in 2019. During a heavily curated Vogue interview, where the choice of publication, the framing, and the subjects discussed all appeared carefully aligned with a specific public image, Harry told the world that he and Meghan Markle planned to have no more than 2 children for environmental reasons. Climate concerns were presented as the rationale. A smaller family footprint was framed as a contribution to planetary sustainability during a period of growing concern about environmental issues. Again, let's separate fact from interpretation. The fact is that Harry said it publicly in a major interview and that the statement received widespread coverage. The fact is that several people who knew him well reportedly found the comment surprising because Harry had long been described as someone who wanted a large family. The speculation, and I am labeling it as speculation, is the view held by many royal observers that the statement reflected Meghan Markle's public positioning and priorities more than Harry's long-standing personal wishes. What gives that interpretation traction is the contrast now sitting in plain sight. Chelsy Davy, the woman who reportedly had those genuine family-building conversations with Harry years earlier, has just welcomed a third child. That third child stands in direct contrast to the public argument that 2 was the ideal number. If the 2-child limit represented a deeply personal belief Harry independently arrived at, it would be much easier to place alongside Chelsy's choices without the comparison feeling particularly meaningful. Instead, because of those earlier conversations and Harry's reported language about wanting a tribe rather than a carefully managed family footprint, the 2019 statement now reads to many observers less like a personal conviction and more like a departure from one. Make sure you subscribe to the Palace Debrief so you never miss what comes next, and leave your opinion below. Did the 2-child announcement strike you as Harry's authentic position, or did it feel more like strategic brand messaging from the very beginning? Now let's move to the One Young World Conference in Manchester, because multiple royal commentators have described this event as a major turning point in how informed observers began evaluating the Sussex public operation. For many, it was the moment the gap between the stated mission and the visible execution became impossible to ignore, especially in front of the exact audience the Sussexes most needed to impress. The conference brought together young leaders from around the world. These were people working on real problems in real communities. They traveled to Manchester specifically to engage with global challenges and the type of service-focused work the Sussex operation frequently describes as central to its mission. This was not a celebrity gathering. It was not a red carpet appearance. It was not a branding exercise. This was the audience the mission statement was supposedly written for. If these attendees left impressed, it would reinforce the idea that the mission was genuine rather than cosmetic. The speech lasted roughly 20 minutes. Analysts who later reviewed the transcript claimed that during those 20 minutes, Meghan Markle referenced herself, her own experiences, emotions, reactions, and observations more than 50 times. The speech repeatedly returned to the same focal point: her journey, her recognition, her moments of realization, her experiences at important tables, her feelings of disbelief at finding herself among world leaders. Even the story of saving a paper place card as proof that she belonged. Structurally and thematically, critics argued that the speech focused far more on Meghan Markle than on the young leaders who had come to Manchester hoping to engage with meaningful discussions about global challenges. Ella Robertson, daughter of the organization's co-founder, reportedly reacted to the speech with a remarkably blunt assessment. According to accounts of the event, her conclusion was simple: it had been ruined. The criticism mirrored what transcript analysts later highlighted. Time after time, the attention returned to Meghan rather than the audience the conference existed to serve. Tom Bower has pointed to this speech as one of the clearest early examples of what he sees as a recurring issue within the Sussex philanthropic operation. His argument is that when presented with significant platforms designed for substantive engagement, the focus frequently shifts toward personal narratives rather than outward service. That matters because service and impact are central to the Sussex mission statement. Critics argue that the gap between the stated purpose and what was delivered in Manchester was noticeable enough to provoke reactions from people sitting inside the room itself. The contrast between a speech that uses personal stories to illuminate broader issues and a speech where the personal story becomes the main event was visible to attendees. And judging by the reactions that emerged afterward, many people in that audience reached conclusions of their own. This is the pattern critics and longtime observers of the Sussex operation keep circling back to across appearance after appearance. The argument is not necessarily that the work itself is insincere. The criticism is that the presentation repeatedly seems to place the spotlight on the presenter rather than the purpose. And Manchester was not just any audience. It was a room filled with young leaders actively doing the kind of service work being discussed. These were people who understand what meaningful impact looks like because they are living it every day. That is why the reaction mattered. The difference between message and delivery appeared visible enough to provoke the response it did from attendees who arrived expecting something else entirely. Now let's move to Jordan, because the footage from that trip deserves a closer examination than the usual tabloid headline treatment. There is a major difference between building an entire narrative around a single photograph and examining extended footage captured across multiple appearances, locations, and days. The Jordan trip provided exactly that opportunity. Analysts had material from multiple public appearances over 2 separate days, allowing them to compare patterns instead of relying on isolated moments. The recurring observation identified by several analysts working independently from one another involves Harry's physical responses to Meghan Markle's public displays of affection. The hand-reaching, the deliberate closeness, the visible physical connection that had become a familiar feature of their public appearances from the earliest stages of the relationship through much of the following years. In the Jordan footage, critics argue that those responses appear noticeably different. Not subtly different, visibly different. The physical distance that seems to emerge between them, not despite being in public, but while standing together in public view. Moments where contact appears less welcomed than before. Instances where movement seems to create space rather than close it. Now, I am not presenting body language analysis as scientific proof. What I am pointing out is that multiple analysts reviewing the same footage arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. Those conclusions also align with several other observable developments reported over the last 12 months. The 88-day stretch without a shared photograph. The increasingly separate professional paths. Reports citing different schedules and increasingly independent day-to-day routines. When viewed together, supporters of this interpretation argue that the Jordan footage fits into a broader pattern rather than standing alone as an isolated event. The pattern itself is what analysts continue discussing. What that pattern ultimately means for the relationship is where interpretation begins. My reading of those observations remains exactly that, an opinion rather than a certainty. Now let's talk about the Vanity Fair report because, commercially and personally, it may represent the most consequential element of this entire story for Harry specifically. The nature of the report itself deserves careful attention. Vanity Fair is not a tabloid publication. It operates with editorial standards, fact-checking procedures, and a reputation that carries accountability for what appears in print. That distinction matters. When Vanity Fair reports that a post-divorce manuscript has reportedly been pitched to publishers and that interest in that manuscript is substantial, the claim naturally carries more weight than similar reporting appearing in celebrity gossip outlet. According to the report, the proposal involves a book that Meghan Markle has either prepared herself or had prepared on her behalf, a manuscript reportedly being held in reserve and intended for publication should a separation from Harry occur. The focus, according to the reporting, is life after the marriage ends. Not a wellness guide. Not a business manual. Not a leadership manifesto. A book centered on the marriage and what follows afterward. To understand why so many commentators view this as such a significant issue for Harry, it is important to understand what Spare represented and what a comparable memoir from Meghan Markle's perspective could potentially represent. Spare achieved enormous commercial success, but it also left lasting consequences. Relationships with family members changed. Relationships with his brother, his father, and the institution itself were affected. Every private conversation described. Every family disagreement recounted. Every personal moment transformed into published material became part of a permanent public record. Harry understands exactly what that process feels like from the author's side because he chose to publish those stories. He made the decision to place private conversations and deeply personal moments into the public marketplace, fully aware that those involved would eventually read them. But he also understands the experience from the opposite side. He is part of a family that spent years watching private experiences become material for public consumption. He knows what happens when deeply personal conversations leave the living room and enter bookstores around the world. That is why critics argue that a memoir from Meghan Markle's perspective could carry such significance. A book covering the inside story of their marriage, the disagreements, the confidences, the private decisions, the conversations that occurred behind closed doors when Harry may have believed he was speaking only to his wife and not to a future readership numbering in the millions. Such a book, according to those observers, would place Harry in a position remarkably similar to the one Prince William and King Charles III found themselves in after Spare. His private life would become someone else's commercial narrative. The words spoken in confidence would become published material. The trust placed in private conversations would become accessible to a global audience. In other words, he would experience firsthand the same sensation many believed his family experienced when reading Spare, watching deeply personal moments transformed into a product for public consumption. This is why several commentators describe the possibility as the invisible leverage operating behind the scenes. The factor that, in their view, makes the situation considerably more complicated than a simple decision about whether to remain in a marriage facing visible pressures or walk away from it. Whether that interpretation proves accurate is another question entirely. But as a theory explaining the current dynamics, it remains one of the most discussed and closely examined aspects of the broader story. Whether that manuscript actually exists in the form being described, whether the reported pitch was a genuine publishing strategy or a carefully placed signal sent through a magazine both parties know Harry pays attention to, neither of those questions can be answered with certainty from the outside. What can be verified is much simpler. The report exists. Vanity Fair published it. And Harry has not publicly challenged or disputed the claim. Then there is the security dispute, which adds another fascinating layer to the broader picture because it highlights what critics see as a growing gap between Harry's stated position and his observable behavior. His stated position is clear. He argues that the threat level facing him in the United Kingdom is serious enough to require taxpayer-funded armed police protection whenever he visits and that, without that protection, travel to Britain becomes extremely difficult or impossible. These are not destinations universally associated with low-risk environment. They are countries where documented security concerns exist and where threat assessments are taken seriously. Yet Harry has traveled to those locations without the exact level of formal protection he argues is essential for visits to London. The contrast is difficult to ignore. Critics view this as a major inconsistency. Supporters counter that the specific risks Harry faces in Britain are unique, involving media attention, public visibility, and individuals who may present a different category of threat than those encountered elsewhere. Both arguments exist. Both sides have made their case repeatedly. But the observable reality is that the contrast between the claimed threat level and the actual travel choices has fueled significant public skepticism. And that skepticism has become one of the biggest obstacles facing Harry in the broader debate over security funding. That skepticism has also weakened his position in the political conversation surrounding whether public resources should be committed to his protection. Public patience with the security argument has been wearing thin for years. Part of that reaction is emotional, part of it is financial, and part of it reflects a very specific British sense of fairness. The public sees an economy under pressure, public services stretched thin, families dealing with rising costs and shrinking resources. Then they see a former prince who voluntarily stepped away from the institution that would have provided security as part of his role, built an expensive life overseas, and now argues that British taxpayers should continue funding protection at a level similar to what he would have received had he remained within the system. Whether people agree or disagree with that position, it is undeniably a difficult case to make in a way that inspires widespread public sympathy. And this is where all of these threads begin converging into a single picture. I want to separate observation from interpretation because that distinction matters. The observable facts are these. Chelsy Davy has welcomed her third child, and her publicly visible life closely resembles the family and career model Harry reportedly described wanting during their years together. Harry publicly announced a two-child limit in 2019, a statement that surprised several people who reportedly knew him well. The One Young World speech in Manchester contained more than 50 self-references during a 20-minute address delivered to young global leaders, and reactions from some attendees reportedly reflected concerns later highlighted by transcript analysis. The Jordan footage has produced similar conclusions from multiple independent body language commentators examining extended footage rather than isolated photograph. Vanity Fair reported the existence of a post-divorce manuscript allegedly pitched to publishers, and that report remains unretracted. According to multiple reports, Harry does not currently have Prince William's direct phone number. He was reportedly absent from Peter Philip's wedding guest list while most senior and extended members of the royal family attended. And no summer meeting with King Charles III has been publicly confirmed. Those are the facts. The interpretation begins when those facts are viewed together. Looking across the pattern of the last 12 to 18 months, critics see the outline of a specific story emerging. A man confronting the cumulative consequences of decisions made over many years. A man watching a version of the future he once imagined become increasingly unreachable. At the same moment, he is confronted with two very different mirrors. One is the image presented by Chelsy Davy's photograph. Not a hypothetical future. Not a theoretical possibility. A real life captured in real images. 3 children, privacy, independence, stability. The exact kind of future he reportedly spoke about wanting years ago. The other mirror is found in the more difficult questions surrounding his current situation. The Jordan footage. The Vanity Fair report. The growing scrutiny surrounding public appearances and personal circumstances. My interpretation is that these elements carry weight because they are happening simultaneously. The Chelsy Davy photographs are significant because they are tangible. They are not an idea. They are a visible example of a life once discussed becoming someone else's reality. The Jordan footage is significant because critics argue it captures moments that the carefully managed public presentation is finding increasingly difficult to contain. That is my reading of the situation, and I am presenting it as interpretation rather than certainty. The facts themselves are documented. The speech transcript, the Vanity Fair report, the Jordan footage, the Chelsy Davy announcement, the reported wedding exclusion, the reports regarding communication with Prince William. The narrative connecting those events is my own interpretation, offered openly as analysis rather than established truth. Now I want to hear from you. When you look at the pattern that has emerged over the last year, does it strike you as someone approaching a major personal turning point? Or do you think the public presentation remains strong enough to continue exactly as it is? And what about the Chelsy Davy situation? Do you think seeing a former partner living a version of the life you once described wanting genuinely affects people when they are already questioning their choices? Or does that place too much meaning on what is ultimately a set of baby photos shared on social media? Drop your honest opinion in the comments below. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive analysis, subscribe to the Palace Debrief so you never miss what we cover next. And if this breakdown gave you something to think about, hit the like button because it genuinely helps the channel grow. Until next time, take care and I'll see you in the next one.